I want to go home. I want to be with my parents. But there's no way I could.
Being hit by a hand, strap, or a wooden ruler. I have a scar on my head from that wooden ruler.
Couldn't they have done it differently? With kindness instead of treating us like, I would have to say, cattle.
It was the truth about a brutal past and a massive will to confront it. 7,000 witnesses, 7 national events, a final report of 6 volumes.
Well, to know truth, we must begin by telling it.
No one doubted his credentials when Manitoba's first Aboriginal judge took on the job of commission chair. Survivors told their stories, and Murray Sinclair listened. He opened a door for their healing and made it swing wide.
For the survivors in this room, the most important gesture of reconciliation that they will ever see in their lives is for you to tell them that you love them.
For 6 years, Justice Murray Sinclair has been a dogged seeker of truth, and now his leadership has set the tone for reconciliation. We met earlier today in Ottawa. This has been a pretty intense period for everybody, from the witnesses to the commissioners, and obviously including yourself.
Yes.
What has the toll been on you personally going through this?
Well, it's going on just over 6 years now that we've been doing it. We started in 2009, and as a result, the work we knew was going to be physically demanding, and it has been. We've recorded over 7,200 statements from survivors through our hearings.
And that's the emotional stress of listening to those stories.
And the emotional stress of it, and the spiritual challenge as well. I feel the weight of the work constantly. I've often remarked to our survivor committee members when I've met with them that one of the challenges that I face personally, and I'm sure that commissioners face as well, is that we were engaged in work, and we are engaged in work in which you can't stop thinking about it. You literally can't stop thinking about the stories of the survivors, their children's stories, the work that we're doing, the challenges of getting the documents, the challenges of the making the commission work, the challenges of planning the events. So all of that has been a constant part of my life, more so than anything else I've ever done. But I do know that I will need some time in order to be able to put this all in a proper place for myself, and I may write a book.
You're going to try and put it in a proper place for Canadians starting tomorrow.
Yes.
With the recommendations.
Yeah.
And I sense that you're going to be calling for a full reset on the relationship.
Absolutely. We think it begins with leadership. Leadership across the country and at the national level needs to rethink their role as in government for one start, in terms of what it is that they've been doing as government authorities with respect to Indigenous people, and what needs to be done in order to establish that relationship in a proper way. We looked at the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, for example, as a starting point for ourselves, because we didn't think there was any reason to reinvent the wheel. And one of their major recommendations was that there should be a royal proclamation issued that would be able to put the relationship back on its feet. And so we picked up on that, and we think that a royal proclamation is also the right way to go. And we think it should focus on reconciliation.
But that didn't get anywhere.
It didn't then. I think the atmosphere in this country is different now.
You mentioned the royal proclamation, but there'll be a lot more than that in these recommendations. It does seem like a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians that goes back hundreds of years.
Yes. Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has been the point that we think should be the starting point for the discussions on reconciliation between Aboriginal leaders and non-Aboriginal leaders in this country.
Canada didn't sign that.
They did adopt it, though. And they did adopt it as an aspirational document, and that's their words. And we agree with that. It should be an aspirational document. So what we're saying to them is, aspire to it. And let's talk about what you need to do to aspire to it.
Have they done anything in that regard since they said there was an aspirational document?
Well, this particular government and these particular leaders haven't. But this particular government and these particular leaders will not always be there. There will be others. And so we have approached our report from the perspective that it needs to talk to the future as well. It needs to be a reference document going on for generations to come.
I want to scratch a little deeper on the issue of action that takes place in the days ahead.
Yes.
Because you know, and I know, because our generations have seen it enough times,
Yes.
where reports similar to this, not as extensive as this, but similar to this, arrive, they get a couple of days discussion, and then they go up on a very tall shelf, and they're not seen again.
Often not even a tall shelf. That's the history of commissions. There's no question of that. They're often government commissions, and government commissions are often created by government for their own purposes of deflection intentionally from the beginning. This commission was not created that way. This commission was created by the parties to the settlement agreement, and so it had a separate momentum behind it from the beginning. So we think, and we have written our report from the perspective that while there are some elements of our recommendations addressed to government, many of our elements, many of our recommendations, and many of the calls to action are actually aimed at Canadian society. Because what we have to say is that it's going to take a whole entire nation's approach to this. And so if a government at the national level or at a provincial level decides that for their own reasons they don't want to implement the report, we want to ensure that there is momentum going on around them and that eventually they'll see that they have to catch up.
If the past has taught us anything, it's that for governments, for political parties, there's not necessarily a big momentum upwards for them to grasp onto this issue.
Right.
And yet there is no penalty for not grasping onto it. Do you really sense there's anything different right now?
Absolutely. Even the statement from the Chief Justice of Canada describing this experience as cultural genocide is a statement you would never have heard from any Chief Justice in the history of this country.
And do you agree with that statement?
I think that I do. I think that we need to understand that the relationship between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people, and in particular government, since Confederation has been one in which the government of Canada has deliberately attempted to wipe out the culture and language of Aboriginal people. And we have seen it not only in the way that residential schools were created and run, but we've also seen it in legislative changes which prohibited ceremonies. For example, the potlatch and Sundance laws of the 1880s made it illegal to participate in ceremonial gatherings. It prohibited the wearing of Indian garb by Indian people. It prohibited people from going into any ceremony such as a sweat lodge. So those legislative changes were clearly designed to wipe out the culture of Indigenous groups. And so to call them cultural genocide would not be an unfair comment.
If your generation of leaders can't convince the other leaders in this country to move on the recommendations that you're talking about, can you control what the next generation and what the current younger generation, some who are very, as you know, militant on this issue,
Yes.
can you control that?
I don't think it's a question of control. I think what it is, it's a question of planning to make sure that it happens in a proper way. And what we have said to government leaders is that education is what got us into this mess, the use of education, at least in terms of residential schools. But education is the key to reconciliation, because we need to look at the way that we are educating children. That's why we say that this is not an Aboriginal problem, it's a Canadian problem. The way that we have educated Indigenous peoples in residential schools to believe that they were heathens and savages and pagans and inferior was the same message we were giving in the public schools. And we need to change that message in the public schools and in the Aboriginal schools as well, to ensure that all children being educated in our school system in Canada are educated to understand the full and proper history of each Indigenous group and the territories in which they live, so that they will grow up learning how to speak to and about each other in a more respectful way. 7 generations of children went through residential schools. It may take us a few generations to fix this.
But when you say that, does that not just give those who want to shelve this, put it as another one of those reports on the shelves? Doesn't that just give them a reason to do that?
Some are going to do it anyway. They're going to do it no matter what it is that we say. What we want to do is we want people to understand that there is a need for us to get this done. There is an urgency about it that we need to recognize.
What's the urgency?
The urgency is those young people who stood up, such as in Idle No More, who basically said, we're not going to take this anymore. And we think that that urgency needs to be recognized. But it's also the urgency of the Canadian population of young people who themselves are saying, there's something wrong here that we need to fix, and we need some help in understanding how to fix it.
When you saw what happened in Missouri and in Baltimore and in Cleveland and in other American cities, where certain segments rose up and said, we're not going to take this anymore.
Yes.
Did you see parallels there?
There are certainly parallels to the nonviolent intention and resistance on the part of those people that I see continuing to happen, and I think people will stand up and say, you have to stop what you're doing to us. I think that will continue. I think that will probably grow in strength and force. So it's on the part of government, police authorities, and all of those entities that currently hold and exercise power in this country that we need to say, you have to understand what it is that you're doing and why it is that you're doing it. Because the evolution of that power imbalance is really at the heart of all of this.
Justice Sinclair, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Peter.